up for a bit of an introduction. Also, this event and the sort of celebration of the New School's centennial is also a way to try to showcase some of the work and the engagement and the research and the practice that's happening here at the New School. I would like to introduce the Urban Systems Lab's work a little bit more fully, and from there we'll transition to an introduction of Jonathan Rose's work and a conversation about not just resilience, but how do we really transform and at a planetary scale. So if you're able, and we can actually roll the introductory video for the Urban Systems Lab, we'll do that now. At the Urban Systems Lab, we're advancing science to improve decision-making for sustainability, resilience, and equity from multiple scales, city, regional, and global scales. And to do this, and what we want to talk about more today, means developing new interdisciplinary approaches and also working with designers and data visualization experts to communicate the science and make it actionable. Essentially, we're trying to create a new field of urban system science to support decision-making for transforming our cities to be more livable, more just, and more sustainable. Our work in the OSL spans the globe. It includes work in the United States, in cities like New York and Miami and San Juan, like you've heard of, also in Hermosillo, Valdivia, and Sao Paulo in Latin America, to cities in China and all across Europe. And we're working at this global level, including with the UN, with the IPCC, with IPBES, with Future Earth, to provide science to shift global policy, at the same time as working locally to compare our learning across cities to better understand what solutions are working, where, why, and how we can better scale those solutions from neighborhood actions to global impact. Essentially, the discussion we're having now, from local to global scales. Some of the core goals of the USL are to use our science and design to improve the lives of the most vulnerable people in ecosystems, such as through nature-based solutions, to advance our ability to understand the complexity of urban dynamics, and to develop systemic solutions to adapt to climate change and build resilience. This is some of the work we're doing in New York City, for example, to advise the mayor's office on resilience interventions for urban flooding. And we're doing this work with a commitment to communities and neighborhoods, as well as at city and regional scales, to co-design policy planning and climate governance for real transformations. And we do this by taking a systems approach, as you're seeing here. For us, that means improving cities by taking seriously the reality of the complexity of interactions between the social economic, the ecological biophysical, and the technological infrastructural domains of urban systems, and making progress across these domains and their interactions simultaneously. We work on a few major themes, including equity and justice. And as you've been hearing about this morning, historical legacies of injustice in our cities mean that low-income and minority communities are the ones most at risk from climate change impacts and other pressing urban challenges. In New York, for example, our work is showing that 800,000 people living in potential environmental justice communities are living below the 100-year floodplain. At the USL, we're working with communities and city government to call attention to climate injustice and to help prioritize where climate adaptation and resilience intervention should go. Our work on climate change is examining the future of flooding and flood risk in multiple cities. We're bringing advanced flood risk modeling and projections together with data visualization to provide decision makers with actionable knowledge on where flooding is likely to occur, and under many kinds of scenarios. For example, from extreme rainfall and coastal storm surge, which ultimately is to help us understand what critical infrastructure is at risk and how it should be changed, and what populations are most at risk and should be prioritized for protection. We're also advancing the science in a more systems and integrated way to understand what drives heat in the city. What is the future of heat, and what will heat risk look like in the future? And the goal with that work is to deliver this science at high resolution scales to both neighborhood organizations and city agencies to enable them to spatially prioritize investments like green infrastructure we've talked about to protect the most vulnerable from the current and future heat risks. To do this work requires advanced computation, working with big data and novel data streams, using machine learning to build AI that can help us learn from past changes to project a realistic idea of where we're headed in the near and longer term futures. And we advance urban data science to better understand complex systems and complex problems, to bring these advances to our work with local communities, so that they have access to the same data, modeling, and design advances that have mostly been available only to wealthy cities and the private sector. Of course, it's not enough to advance the science, as we've been discussing this morning. We also have to communicate well. We've built the USL DataVis platform as an open, interactive, online tool to support decision-making at multiple levels, to provide data more democratically, and to create a more intuitive interaction with the changing urban data landscape. Now, we don't do this work alone. Rather, we're working with local community organizations that we've been discussing today, city governments, many top research institutions, all to advance the science and to bring our work with communities as shared partners in co-designing ways to envision more positive urban futures, and to assess those visions, the scenarios that come out of them, in order to actually identify the social, the ecological, the technological pathways to move quickly towards the future that we want. So we invite you to join us and follow us and support us in making our cities more livable, more just, more sustainable, and more resilient. Thanks. We just wanted to introduce our work a little bit since we didn't have a chance to earlier. I also want to thank Daniel Sauter and Claudia Tomateo and Orpheus Scutelis, who are on our DataVis team, for the work they've done. And basically, you know, what we're doing here today, and we're very pleased to be able to have a conversation with our colleagues in Puerto Rico, our colleagues in New York. And now that you've heard a bit about the Urban Systems Lab work, we want to sort of move this to a conversation also with Jonathan Rose. And so I'm going to introduce Jonathan Rose and allow him, similar to the format of the last one, to give some opening comments about some of his work, some of his thinking that is both about climate change resilience, but also about how we transform the human enterprise on this planet to one that's more in balance and move towards planetary health, which I know he's going to tell you some more about. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Jonathan Rose. He's the founder and president of the Jonathan Rose Companies, a real estate development, planning, consulting, and investment firm. The firm is a national developer of green, affordable, and mixed income communities and is implementing affordable housing investments to preserve and enhance affordable housing. Mr. Rose is a thought leader in a wide range of urban issues and the development of communities of opportunity. He's received many awards, including MIT's Visionary Leadership Award, the Urban Land Institute's Global Award for Excellence, more that I could describe. He's also written a book on how to create resilient cities, which I hope we can talk a little bit about, called The Well-Tempered City: What Modern Science, Ancient Civilizations, and Human Nature Teach Us About the Future of Urban Life, which was published in 2016 by Harper Wave, and also won the 2017 Prose Award for Outstanding Scholarly Work by a trade publisher. Mr. Rose graduated from Yale, from the University of Pennsylvania, and actually has an honorary doctorate from here at the New School. So we're very happy to have Jonathan Rose back and invite you to come and start us off with some key thoughts. Thank you, Jonathan.
Great. I'm actually going to sit down here and I'm going to lead you through a visualization. Before we start, I have a presentation to make, but in a conversation. But before we start, I'm going to actually lead you through a meditation. And here's the reason why. As you all know, we're living in a very chaotic, the military describes this as a time of VUCA: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And we've heard a tremendous amount about resilience, about community-based input, about failed infrastructure, about enormous challenges. And we very rarely hear about where are we actually going and what does it actually look like. You know, if we actually did solve all these problems, how would it be? America actually as a nation is very reactive. We're very used to taking action, but we're very resistant to really long-range planning. So I want to reframe put us in a different mental context for this conversation. So I want you to close your eyes. This will just take a few minutes. Put your feet on the floor if you can. Take a few deep breaths, and as you breathe, focus on the air going in and out of your nose. That actually moves your brain from your amygdala to your prefrontal cortex. Now imagine that it's 2080 and you're in whatever city or place you want to be. You get to pick. And imagine that we've actually solved the climate change issue. The flywheel effects are going to take centuries to actually overcome, but we've actually walked up to the sources of energy and sources of biodiversity loss, and we're well on our way to solving them, or we have solved them. It will take, as I say, centuries for it all to be implemented, but you can rest in the peace of knowing that we've actually walked up to the issue and resolved it. And imagine that we've solved income inequality. And imagine that we've solved racial bias and injustice. And that we've actually thought through what is the right infrastructure to achieve this. And through a whole series of processes, there's actually consensus. People are happy with the state. They feel secure. So imagine that state. Imagine you're literally there. And walk around that city or place in your mind. Just go visit it for a little bit. What does it look like? What does it sound like? What's the vibrational tone of it? So I actually don't want to leave that place, but we need to move on with what we're going to do today. So come on back to the room. And I actually want to ask them a question. So describe, just shout out, what was it like? Just somebody give a few words as to what it was like to be in that place. Clean solar cells. What? I'm sorry. Bicycles. Okay, what else? Plants. Fresh air. Overpopulated. No one was wealthy.
I'm still at the bottom.
You're still at the what?
I'll still be at the bottom. People can't get over implicit bias. I'll still be at the bottom.
She says people can't go over implicit bias. What else? Trees. Great. So my sense is that it's a, by the way, one of the things people often say is it was quiet. It was like an amazing to be in a city that was like full of people and it was quiet because everything was electric and smoothed out. So the reason I did that was because I believe we need to have a sense of where we're going to figure out we're going to get there. So first of all, we know the world is very rapidly urbanizing. By 2080, the time of that exercise, 80% of the world's population will be living in cities. And the reason why that's important is it tells us that cities are the place where the greatest impact is happening, but where also the greatest solutions can take place. They're what Jaime Lerner would call the acupuncture points of society. And we know that in this vast urbanization, the distribution of opportunity is quite unequal around the world, and the distribution of infrastructure is quite unequal. This is Karachi, enormous traffic jams we're seeing actually in the developing world. We know the world is rapidly, we're becoming more consumers, which means we're consuming far too much, that we're destroying the air. This is New Delhi, that a part of what comes with climate change is a new distribution of where there's water and where there's not going to be enough water. Income, this is Sao Paulo. We know that income inequality and disparities are rapidly growing. That automation is coming, which is going to eliminate jobs, and that there are cracking points. I'm actually really surprised that we don't have another Occupy Wall Street or similar movement in New York today, considering the issues. This is in London in 2011. when all of a sudden these riots completely, we thought out of the blue, appeared. The deeper the red in this map of London, the deeper the poverty. And everywhere there's a little Google dot is where the riots took place. And you'll see they weren't in the poorest neighborhoods. They were actually in the neighborhoods where the lower middle class, second generation immigrants felt that the invisible lines of society were impenetrable and they could not move forward with their lives. So I take all these issues and I look at the solutions and I put them into 4 buckets, 4 big buckets, which I call pathways to planetary health. The first one is half Earth. We know that we have to preserve the Earth's biodiversity, and E.O. Wilson says that we have to preserve at least half the Earth, and he's mapped out where that needs to be. The second one is ecological civilization, which is actually a Chinese, there's ideas in many places, but the Chinese are the one who are really working on this. But literally everything that we do, whether it's how we make our energy, how we build our cities, how we source our materials, all of that has to leave the kind of capitalistic linear system, materialistic system that we currently function in, and has to become part of a cyclical, resilient, ecologically based system. The third thing is a regenerative economy. We have to move from an economic system that actually rewards regeneration. Actually, our current economic system has a bias towards degeneration. In our current system, you do best if you mine stuff from the earth, exploit people, build, make stuff, sell stuff, and throw it out. Because we don't take into account what we call externalities. That's just a mental framework. It's all one whole integrated system. So we need a system that rewards the benefits of regeneration. And the last thing is we need a mental framework that I call pervasive altruism. Unless we develop an ethical system for the Anthropocene, unless we develop a mental framework which is built on pervasive sense of altruism, we will never achieve the other things. This is an image that somebody did of London around 2080. And what we're seeing is that when you look at images from all around the world, there's a commonality. Number one, people are saying we want much higher density. In Singapore now, you can't build a building less than 50 stories tall. The second thing is we want to infuse the city with nature. The third thing is we want to connect it with mass transit systems that are really efficient and equitable. And the result will be, beautiful skies. And so you see there's a commonality in kind of the human instinct as to what the next generation of cities should be. And as I said, we're seeing this all over the world. To get there, I'm actually proposing a system that is based on the very way that nature herself works. In nature, we have something called the metagenomics. That is the DNA that ties us all together. It's why humans and frogs have 92% of the same DNA, and why humans and banana trees have 50% of the same DNA. That is the meta system that integrates us all. It's why humans breathe in oxygen and out carbon dioxide, and trees breathe in carbon dioxide and out oxygen. This magnificent thing that ties us all isn't random. We have co-evolved a code for how we do this. We don't have that same integrative framework for our cities. Epigenetics is a feedback loop. So how genes actually get expressed is continually dynamically happening in real time. The proteome is the building, think the word proteins. Those are actually the building blocks of cities. The metabolomics, metabolism, is the energy and the material flow through the city. And those are continually in nature in an integrated cycle. When we do master plans, for example, they are physical plans typically of cities. We don't have a social plan that's integrated. We don't have an economic plan nationally often that's integrated. And we certainly don't have a metabolic plan of the flow of materials, energy, waste, et cetera, through the system that's all tied together. And yet this is the way organic systems actually work. So think about it as the metagenomics as a master plan, building codes, zoning codes. Epigenetics are feedback loops. Proteomes are the building materials, the infrastructure. Metabolomics are materials, water, energy, markets, incentives, et cetera. And imagine if we put those into a dynamic system. And we created a new planning system that actually started with a vision of where we're going, not a short-term vision, because if you have a 2030 vision or whatever, you can't imagine something perfect enough in a short time because you're too constrained by reality. But you can imagine transformation over 30 or 50 years easily. And then you can really set the goal to really, really get there. And you can figure out what the first steps are to do there, to get there. You need to plan. We talk a minute about community health indicators, which are ways to measure how you're doing. And then governments have the tool of not only regulation, like plans, but they make investments in infrastructure. They have incentives like tax breaks. And most importantly, they also have leadership. They actually can communicate or not communicate a vision. You can measure the outcomes and you compare to the community health indicators and create a feedback loop. This is a vision, by the way, that the people of Portland did for the city of Portland about 15 years ago. And they said, we want to be a denser city. For them, this was dense. We want green buildings. They put solar on the side of their building in this image and wind on the roof, neither which work, but they communicate the idea that we want to be greener. They said we want multiple means of transportation, so you see light rail and a bus and a green car and bicycles and people walking. There's a park to the left. There's Oregon-grown local food to the right. There's a happy child telling them that they want to be a family-friendly city. There's a 100-page report that goes with this, but there's an image. They had a sense of who they want to be and how they want to get there. This is what a community health indicator map looks like. You work on community base, you do a whole lot of community listening sessions, and you find out. So we spend a lot of time asking people, what's the matter? We reverse the question, you ask, what matters to you? And what you find, and then, there's no limit, by the way. It's not like what matters to you competes with what matters to me. We can listen to it all. So in this case, people, for example, said traffic congestion, and they wanted income disparity was an issue. They wanted measured energy use and greenhouse gas emissions and green construction and parks and open space and voter participation in off-year elections, volunteering, residents' perception of safety, drug abuse, students receiving AP grades, the whole series of things. And that became the definition of that community's view of community health. We can measure all of these things now in big data. We have the data that measures all these, but we never integrate that data all into one place. We can map it and really compare the health of a community with the vision that we have for the community. And then, as I described earlier, we can create feedback loops where we can, in real time, adjust our investments, our incentives, our zoning plans, the things that we do as cities and as city managers. We can adjust them in real time to continually optimize towards getting towards the goals that the community actually set in its vision. To me, that's a much more dynamic system. This is something called Urban Footprint, which is developed, it's a software program developed by an architect, Peter Calthorpe, and it's a future casting method. It's a way that you can actually put in a plan and see what are the climate impacts, what are the health impacts, what are the income disparity impacts, what are the traffic impacts, air quality impacts, et cetera. You can run like 10,000 iterations, very quickly. So you can kind of come up with you know your community, you know where you want to go, you can now test all kinds of different ways to get there in real, very quickly, and figure out the scenario that optimizes all the decisions you have to make that gets you closest to where you want to go. It doesn't mean it's going to be perfect, but it gives you a sense of direction for your first steps. And then you're continually taking real-time data, seeing where you are, at the same time continually future casting different scenarios, and that could really help guide us to get a lot closer to our vision than what we have today. We need to create circular economies, we know that. This is the water treatment plant of Windhoek, which is the capital of Namibia in southern Africa, a rapidly growing city that was running out of water to accommodate its growth. They took its sewer water, purified it, put it back into the drinking water, and that circle allowed the city to grow dramatically. The guy who designed this said, we have to judge water by its quality and not by its history. So I can go on and on. There's a million things that we can be looping to create. By the way, when you create a circular economy, you create more jobs, you create more stability, you create more resilience. I think I'm going to stop with all this so we can get to the, you know what, I'm going to just go to this. This is just another example of a circle, which is a microgrid. right now, again, we make our power basically in big power plants, and it flows through a system and it turns into heat. One of the reasons, it's a very inefficient system, which is why if you put an energy-saving light bulb or whatever, for every BTU you save at the bulb or the appliance, you're saving 3 BTUs at the plant. So it's there's a lot of leverage in energy conservation. But what if we had not only base power, but we also had photovoltaics and wind power, and we were using biodigestion and creating gas, and we're using fuel cells, and we had large storage battery systems and capacitors, et cetera. You actually could double the efficiency of the system, dramatically increase its resilience. You can create what are called self-healing systems. We could, in effect, cut our energy demand in half, and the quality and service of the energy much better, tying everything together. By the way, and you could do this on the energy side, on the water recycling side, on the heat side. And this will create a much more dynamically resilient city. This is Singapore, where I mentioned that they're moving towards buildings that have to be 50 stories tall or more. By the way, their buildings are on the issue of implicit racial bias. They had race riots in '76 and said never again. And so, although it's imperfect, every building must be occupied in the proportion of the race of the country. So, every apartment building will be like 23% this and 18% that and 19% that or whatever. So it's something they're seriously trying to address. But what's happening is, as the city densifies, it creates more walkability, more mixed use, more mixed income, more mass transit. They're able to actually get rid of roads and turn them into parks. So they're weaving biodiversity back into the system through the use of density. I'm going to end with this. I actually believe that our mission is to make wholeness. And we need to have a vision of what wholeness is. We need to aim towards it. And that, as Christopher Alexander said, making wholeness heals the maker. So let's go to the conversation. Thank you.
Take one in the middle. Thank you. Thank you for that, and for a lot of the inspiration of a number of ideas. As you can tell from some of the work we're doing in the Urban Systems Lab, I'm a bit of a data geek, right, and get really excited about how we can sort of think from a systems perspective. But when you were guiding us through this meditation, I also had this calm, quiet city, right, and the other thing I heard was crickets, and maybe that's because I'm an ecologist, and right, and being in nature is where I feel more comfortable sometimes. Still, I wanted to talk more, start with this idea of visioning, and how do we even get to that vision in some of the work that we were talking about that Tisha and Pablo, for example, are part of, and I think this overlaps with some of the work that Amy's been doing in RBD, is working with communities to understand their visions.
Right.
And when we have done that, and we've done, I think, similar right, to what you've been talking about, said, well, let's go to 2080, or let's go to 2100, just for the suspend, right, reality for a little bit of the present to imagine where you're headed. And I think on the one hand, it's extremely powerful. On the other hand, it's very difficult for people to do that. And I wonder what that tension is, and how you've thought about that in terms of both the power of longer term thinking, and what are some of the fundamental reasons why we struggle so much to do it, even when maybe we've created an inclusive, diverse space for people to go through that process. This focus on the immediate present that is actually challenging us to get to the future right, that we want.
So we have a short period of time, so I just jumped to that.
No,
what I'm saying, I just jumped to this vision.
Okay.
But really, in a community-based process, yeah, what you first have to start with is understanding where people are. Before you can take them to where they want to go, you have to start where they are. My work is in building affordable and mixed income housing. We work in low-income communities around the country. And the first thing our residents tell us is they want safety. Mm-hmm. Our residents tell us they're not eating a week a month. They tell us that that their health is poor and their access to health services are poor. So those are, and by the way, after those priorities, then the next thing they tell us is they really would like a life infused with arts and culture and music. Mm-hmm. And the next thing they tell us is they want a community that's filled with love. Mm-hmm. I mean, these are in general, every community is different, but the point is you have to address those issues before, to give people the foundation upon which they can then have a larger vision. So I happen to have been on a team that went into New Orleans pretty soon after Katrina to try and do a long-term master plan. And what was so, whether it was the president of the bank we were talking to or somebody just lost his job as a security guy in the hospital, you'd start a conversation and the first thing to say is, I lost everything. My family photos, my this, my that. I mean, they were so traumatized by that. Traumatized people, we know cognitively cannot do long-term planning. You have to help heal the trauma first. And so, anyway, the bottom line is you have to really start with people where they are and start with really figuring out how to address their current needs to get them. And that builds confidence too. When you actually do address people's needs, then they can trust, and I heard the word trust used a lot in the previous panel, to be able to move towards a larger vision.
When we have been doing some of these visioning exercises, it's something we've been doing here, not just at the New School, but with a whole range of collaborators. And we've done some of this work in Harlem here in New York City. We've done it in San Juan. And in Harlem, we were talking about, we thought we were going to talk about resiliency. And we thought we were going to talk about flood protection and protecting from heat waves. And not surprisingly, people wanted to talk about affordable housing, job security, and basic needs, right? On the other hand, when we were discussing this with a whole diverse group of stakeholders in San Juan, Puerto Rico, we heard similar things, but we also heard that once you had an ability to sort of just take 3 or 4 hours, try to forget about that for a little bit, and think about 2050 or 2080 and the kind of Puerto Rico that you want, people got very innovative. And I was kind of amazed at some of the things that came out, actual conversations about retreating from the coastline. Even though there's so much of a cultural history and attachment to that, the kinds of things that are challenged when you try to figure that out in 10 years from now. So I'm also kind of curious though, because you're a big thinker, and I warned everyone we were going to shift the conversation here, and we are. How much is possible in terms of really doing long-term planning? Because fundamentally, I think the other challenge we have is that we're just not wired to think long-term. We've never responded to reality with some kind of long-term planning, and now we're faced with long-term existential crises that we have to deal with. I mean, how do you put those two together? Yeah.
Okay, so I actually believe that we are wired to long-term thinking, but we don't have a culture that moves towards that wiring. So the first thing is on resilience. So you probably know that 40% of Americans cannot come up with $1,000 of their own savings and calling on every friend and relative they have if there's an emergency. That is a state of non-resilience. And so it's very hard to think about bigger picture resilience when you're in that state.
Absolutely.
So there are some core So resilience is not only about about an ecological state, or it's not only about an infrastructure state, et cetera. It's multiple levels, and it's about our human ability to thrive, our human ability to support ourselves. It's about threats. We have to integrate all those. Our definition of resilience has to integrate all those, and our solutions to resilience have to be. As Amy said with the cell phone picture, we have to integrate, and that's actually where you get the most benefit is through cross-integration. When you're threatened or fearful or at risk or struggling, you're in the amygdala part of the brain, which is the flight-fight part, and it is impossible to do strategic. It's actually, that part of the brain is designed to react. But the prefrontal cortex is a part that is actually designed for strategy and long-term planning and big picture thinking and whole systems integrating. And it actually has a function, also a side function called meta-awareness that actually allows us to be aware of being aware and really think big. So a brief story.
Okay, you're convincing me.
Okay, so the issue is We can create states. We can create states in meetings where you move people from their amygdala to their neo-prefrontal cortex. The meditation I did is like a 30-second way of doing that, but you're right, over 4 hours, you can help people, you have to create the safety and trust, move into that other state of mind. So one day, the librarian of the Oxford Library in England noted that the roof beams that had been holding up the roof, these big magnificent wood beams, were beginning to rot. And so they went to the Oxford forest and they said, we need some big trees. I don't know where the hell you're going to find them. These are oak beams. We need like these huge trees because we got to replace these beams. And the Oxford forest said, well, 400 years ago when we built that building, we planted the trees for their future replacement. We've been waiting for you for 400 years to come with this request. Wow. We know that like in Japan that there are actually people-made stones that predicted future tsunamis that had messages that said, there were messages for the next 1,000 years that told people what to do. Humans do have the capacity to think long term, but we don't create the contexts that allow us to call upon that capacity. There have been 6,000 cultures. I believe there was, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were 6,000 cultures. Some of them are amazingly strategic and long-term thinking. Most of them are incredibly materialistic, frustrated, short-term. And so we just have to imagine a different culture.
But let's dig into that a little bit in terms of how do we actually bring that ability that I agree with you, we have, but we struggle to have for all the reasons that you mentioned. And I think in particular in terms of the kinds of plans and policies that we make. And certainly a lot of the power for change is in more of this top-down power, right? It is in the kind of planning. You mentioned the role of governments and leadership and the funding. So what do you think is the mechanism for that? And I guess actually a really pointed question is the kind of planning we do now actually able to take into long-term planning? Because we do have 2030 plans, but that's in 11 years.
Right, exactly.
Or even we have global plans, the Sustainable Development Goals, that are also 11 years. Right. We can't get there from here.
Right.
So how do we do that? And I think some suggestion in here is that there's some fundamental shifts that have to happen. And from your perspective, what do they look like?
That's a big question. So
not that you can solve it all.
Right. So there are a lot of shifts that need to take place. So first of all, the essential changes that we need to make are at multiple levels, but one level is a complete redesign of our infrastructure. This is going to happen anyway. So for example, I predict that 10 years from now, the majority of cars sold will be electric cars. And 20 years from now, they'll all be electric cars. And although the gas cars will take 30 years to phase out, we are going to electrify our car systems. We are going to, city after city is passing climate resolutions that say we have to reduce our climate impacts. The only way to do that in buildings is to move them from fossil fuel heated or fueled in any other way to being all electric.
All electric, yeah.
Put those two things together, and what they tell us is we must do a massive electrification of our cities. And I showed the microgrid to show that that's part of the way I think we should be thinking. That's an entirely different way of thinking than the way we run our electric systems now. Okay, this is going to take trillions of dollars of investment, enormous planning, and nobody's doing it. There is no national plan. So we know, by the way, this is so stupid because we know it's, there's no way we're not.
It's inevitable.
It is inevitable, and yet nobody, go talk to Con Ed. Have they figured this out? No. So.
At the same time, if you look at the global level, and some of the numbers I've seen is the other inevitability is as the population is growing, that the infrastructure needed to provide services, that's about 90 trillion of new investment that's coming. It's a massive opportunity. Are we going to take that opportunity? Sort of like the Puerto Rico example, are we going to build back the same energy infrastructure, and where's the lever for actually moving forward? So
here's the point. That scale that I've just described has enormous community impacts and needs community input, but it's not something a community can design. The scale of completely transforming the grid and electrifying a city takes engineers and professionals. It takes enormous financing systems. it needs to be done in a way that hears the community needs, et cetera, and integrates those. But the actual design and implementation has got to take place at a very sophisticated power, let's call it higher level power government, finance, et cetera. Now I'm going to give a totally other example. So in 1997, there was a great heat wave in Chicago, and somebody, Eric Kleinenberg, who's now at NYU, mapped where all the people died. And what we discovered was that typically the death rates in the wealthy white communities were low and the death rates in the poor black communities were high, except there are two poor black communities that had the lowest death rates of them all. And the reason was because they built this fantastic social infrastructure based around churches where every single day people checked in on the seniors and made sure that they were okay. And they've been doing that for decades. And so the resilience was there, the network was there when the crisis came. That is a community-based solution that must emerge and must be stimulated and supported at the community level. So I say this because resilience is going to have to weave together all these different. I'll give an intermediate level, which is that pre-Katrina, New Orleans had this horrible hospital called Charity Hospital, and that was where all poor people went. And it was damaged so much during Katrina that it got rebuilt with 87 community-based centers. The big thing went away. It became a distributed system, and then what it meant was if you were diabetic, there was a diabetes center that you could get to easily right near you, and it also meant the jobs got dispersed. So all of a sudden, all those healthcare jobs became community-based jobs. So that I'm calling that like a middle level. So we got to weave all these levels together. To me, the best system to do that is democracy. But I believe we actually need a more social democracy, one that is more focused on actually the well-being of humans in nature and less on needs to use capital. I am a capitalist, but capital shouldn't be its prime purpose. Capital should be a tool to actually achieve these results. It needs, in 1970, we passed the National Environmental Protection Act, and from NEPA came all of our city and state, that all other basically planning and environmental rules come from that. It is a static, undynamic, outdated, inefficient, ineffective, money-wasting system that we should get rid of. By the way, environmentalists hate it when I say that, because it was designed as a system in which environmental groups. Back then, the environmental movement was led by environmental attorneys, and it was designed as a system in which you could sue to prevent things. We need a new system based on vision, based on data, based on community-based input, based on a whole series of things that allows us to co-create a future versus a system whose main bias is to stop the emergence of a future.
So I want to go back to this coordination for large-scale change,
Right.
And where the private sector fits into that, right? Because if you look at the capital and the real ability to do that transformative change, it's not anywhere but in the private sector.
Right.
And to do that seems to me that it's about changing the actual values in the insurance sector, in the development sector. You work in buildings in that sector, and how do we do that also? Because I think, how do you do that in a way where what is valuable? For example, you talked about the way that China is expanding eco-city concepts, and really fundamentally, or Singapore is sort of standing out as a sort of hallmark, but then Shenzhen is working very hard to compete and try to be at that level in terms of fundamentally a new value system, bringing nature into the city in a way that it's a totally different city than the kinds of things we have here in New York, or certainly one I can imagine.
Right.
But that's a massive value shift in terms of where the money's flowing, how the investments, what kinds of regulations are put into place, and in lots of other parts of the world you don't see that.
Right.
And you're the expert in this sphere, so I'm kind of curious about what's possible and what would need to shift for that to happen. And I'll just give one quick example. When we think about the amount of emissions that are still pouring into the atmosphere and trying to really shift our trajectories in terms of the climate change that's coming, not just what's already here, that could shift overnight if all of the banks, I think Bill McKibben pointed this out in a recent article, if all of the banks just said, well, we're not going to lend to you if you are using fossil fuel-based anything. Done.
Right.
But they're not doing that.
I'm
Why
going to
not?
answer that. So I'm going to answer that in a minute. But the first thing is, I believe that we need what I'm calling an ethics of the Anthropocene. So here we are, where as humans, we're having this enormous impact, negative impacts on the environment, negative impacts on other human beings. We have astounding powers that we never had before. And we have not developed an ethical system that matches the demands of the time. And I really think that we need to figure that one out. And I actually think it goes back to two basic principles, which is recognizing that we're all in this together, that we're deeply interdependent, that everything is deeply tied together, and that the solution is always the compassionate one. And if we put those two things together, but we need to figure that out, a really functional ethical system that we lack. To go to the banks, I was recently at a meeting with 20 banks, and what I noticed was, so I asked a lead banker, and these are all the environmental social guys in the banks, and I said, so I asked specifically about, this bank was very proud because it's decided that we'll no longer lend to new coal-fired power plants.
Okay, that's good.
Well, but they're going to keep, if
the
they have
old
an old
ones.
one, they're going to
Yeah.
keep, and they're going to, and they were not getting out of fossil fuels. And Bill McKibben is entirely right that if the banking system just said, we're no longer going to fund the destruction, we don't fund the creation of poison gas to poison people, and
There's other ethics that are already
we don't fund, we're not willing, well, as I say, we don't fund concentration camps, but, so we're actually not going to fund concentration camps. I mean, people, but imagine if they said, we're just not going to fund the destruction of the earth anymore. And you want to run an oil company, you got to go raise equity on Wall Street, or we're not going to raise your equity either. You got to go raise your equity some way because we're just not going to fund destruction anymore. You'd have a massive transformation. So when I asked the bankers, where was their vision? I gave this example of the electrification because I said, it's an astounding opportunity. Trillions of dollars of electrification have to be financed. And there's a way to, somebody should be figuring out the economics of it. And what a big thing to go into. They said to me, we just respond to the loans that our customers come up with. It's their job to do the imagining. And we either accept or reject the loans or the credit or the investments we're supposed to make. But we're just their tool. We're not in charge. We don't have the vision.
It's coming back to a lack of vision.
Right. So imagine if the banking system said, for the privilege of being the financial intermediary of the world, for that privilege comes a responsibility, and for that responsibility, we will develop a vision and an ethical system. And we're going to focus on our profitability. We're not going to destroy our system, but we're going to actually use our system for a higher purpose. That would be amazing.
It would be amazing, and if I put my optimistic hat on,
Yeah.
I tend to consider myself a realist, but in the future, I don't know what that means. It's uncertain, right? But if I'm optimistic about it, then I might say, well, some of that is inevitable too, or should be, because if we understand where we are in the Anthropocene, and we understand some of the challenges that are facing, that those kinds of shifts, they should be inevitable, and it should be just a matter of time. On the other hand, I don't know that that's actually true. I think that's about developing this ethic and trying to figure out where the levers are to actually make those shifts. Because again, when we are in 2080 or 2100, we've got it all mapped out, right? But when we come back to the present and trying to work backwards to what do we need to do in the next 5 years or 10 years, then those conversations that you're having with the bankers, what is the opportunity to say, okay, let's get a vision together and let's make some action on this.
Right. So I think the bank or bankers that actually really put some work into imagining what is the world of 2050, which is not that far away, and what does it take to get there, and be leaders in the financing of it, and actually say, okay, so there's one more thing. We know that eventually there's going to be a carbon tax, and that bit by bit the world is going to get around to saying we really got to get out of fossil fuels. And so we know that those who are stuck in the last 10 or 20% of fossil fuels, those are going to be C-class investments, they're going to be lousy credit, and they're on their way out. And so that's really something, if you could see is going to happen and you got out earlier, would be better than getting out later. And you could also you can see this vast infrastructure revitalization that has to happen, and getting in that earlier and actually being a leader in it, having presence in it. I mean, it just seems to me to make enormous strategic sense for a bank to see this planet and become the leader in this transition. And if a couple big banks do that, then maybe it'll encourage more. But if I were like on the board of directors of a bank and wanted to design my bank to make the most money, be the most stable, profitable, and successful in the future, that's what I would do.
But let's talk about another level of leadership, which is cities.
Yeah.
And we've been talking about cities all day. It's something you've thought a lot about. And your recent book, The Well-Tempered City, has mapping out of all sorts of things that are happening in cities all around the world and happening in lots of sectors and subsystems. One of the things that sort of excites me about what's possible in terms of sort of more radical transformations is the leadership the cities are taking where nation states aren't. So I mentioned earlier today the Paris Agreement, which is essentially an agreement of nations in terms of pledges to reduce impacts on the climate. But where you see the action is in cities. And so I'm curious, too, where you see some optimism in terms of what's possible about the sort of power of cities and what we might call the rise of cities. And that sort of shift that's happening at a planetary scale. Some of the stuff that we've been working on, we think of, and I think of the planet as an urban planet now. And I think that's a radical shift in and of itself. But it's also a shift in power. We don't see that in the United Nations yet, though that's bubbling up. We don't see it in any coordinated way yet, though to some extent through some of the way trade moves. But I'm curious what you see there too, in terms of the kinds of shifts that are necessary that might be in the banking industry or that might be in the energy sector, but actually are going to be driven by the massive amount of investment in infrastructure in cities, driven by people moving there for jobs and houses and sort of normal things.
So cities are where the action is at, and they seem to be a political size in which mayors and city councils have to deliver real results. And so where we're seeing massive polarization, not only in the United States at the national level, but you're seeing it in Poland, in Israel, you're seeing it all over the world. You can pick any place in the world most places at the national level we're moving farther left and farther right, but it's cities, that just isn't happening. People want real direct solutions, and we're seeing a rise of a fantastic class of mayors. There have always been great mayors, but more and more mayors who really view it as a job of innovation and a job of leadership and a way to bring together their communities. And the other great thing is that cities do something called co-opetition. They're all competing, but they're all cooperating. So you have C40 and 100 Resilient Cities and U.S. Conference of Mayors and Global Conference of Mayors and all kinds of the Biodiversity Compact of Cities and all kinds of different networks in which these cities are sharing ideas and best practices, endlessly touring. The people from New Zealand, the City Housing Agency in New Zealand is coming to New York next week. This is always happening. And there's a tremendous knowledge transfer, very open knowledge transfer that's happening at the city level. And so that is the place where the innovation is going to happen. And also, interestingly, it's a place where the best ideas win. So it's not about the biggest. So you're seeing, cities like Amsterdam, which is 400,000, being a leader in rising sea level climate resilience and influencing cities of 10 and 20 million with their ideas. People just want the best ideas, and probably the best ideas are going to come from mid-sized cities because they have more flexibility and, in some ways it's easier. So I'm incredibly optimistic about cities. And cities, in a way, also, I mentioned earlier that I'm a big believer in democracy. And cities are, cities that can be corrupt and they have ward politics. They have all kinds of, they're not perfect, but they are a place where you see democracy in action.
I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So if you're interested in asking a question, think about that. And this is sort of going back to some of your comments when you were presenting in terms of how we can monitor community health.
Right.
What are the sort of shifts that we're seeing from a data side? And this is, to me, sort of massive opportunity in terms of the various kinds of new data streams coming online. And one I find really interesting is when we're thinking about how we've been talking about incorporating community voices, and not just incorporating, but listening and finding, finding the ways where various power centers are better able to understand what the community wants. You know, you say mayors that have, you know, essentially really good intentions, but they also are doing that because they're being told by their constituents about what people want. And social media, for example, has totally changed our ability to listen and the people's ability to communicate. So before we sort of transition to some other questions, what do you see as the opportunity now that this landscape is changing, and not just data, but the ability to compute massive amounts of data to really start to get a better understanding of that complexity of any city, let alone the sort of global complexity as it adds up? Since what we're trying to do, right, is shift that whole global complexity along a pathway that we want, along a planetary health pathway.
So the first thing is we have to have all the data sets talk to each other. They have to be completely integratable, interoperable. And one of the things that we can do with artificial intelligence is really look better for sift amongst all that data and look for trends and look for glimmers of hope and look for pathways and look for combinations and look for efficiencies and things like that. But I want to ground this in a really simple, available today, practical thing that we're doing now in a project with 1,000 people in inner city Newark. And this is a competition that we won, a Fannie Mae competition, so our company is doing this. It's a telehealth program. So voluntarily, in a program that we co-designed with our residents, very much at their input, our residents get their blood pressure, blood oxygen level, pulse, and weight measured once a week, those who volunteer for this. That measurement and all that is done by other residents who are being trained as community health advisors. That goes to doctors, comes back with recommendations not only on medicine, but on healthy diet, on exercise, and on stress reduction, such as yoga and meditation. Based on a much smaller example that we had done, we believe that the outcome of this will save the hospital emergency room system in the local hospital $500,000 to $1 million a year from health savings. If we can build the data that actually proves that, so it's on the resident health side, it's on the hospital side, et cetera, it's just integrating these data sets, then we would love to enter into a health savings, cost savings agreement with the hospital, and that needs to be part of like a Medicaid reimbursement code, et cetera. But imagine if we could take $300,000 a year back to the project to employ community-based community health advisors and you get a virtuous circle going. So it's not just about the data, it's the integration of the data, the health vision, taking the financial savings and recycling back to people, training people, empowering people to have more knowledge and kind of rule over their own health, doing it in a community-based way. So it's using data, finance, people, community systems, tying them all together.
That's great. Let's open it up to the audience. If you have questions, you can come up to the mics. We'll take two, like we did before, and we have hopefully time for a few questions. If you want to start on the left, and then we'll come to the right. Thank you.
Okay, currently World Overshoot Day is in July. It means that we consume more than the planet can possibly support. From what I understand, I believe in the kind of the people-oriented solutions there have to be. But right now, the people mostly, when you're talking about the cities, we're part of the problem in terms of not everybody can't live the way we can. And we really have a level of wealth that is impossible to sustain into the future. And that's like an elephant in the room. And and you can't get to the answer through democracy, because if you ask everybody what they want, they say more wealth, or at least more security, a lot of that. So my question comes in, how do you envision maybe your morality or your other ideas of the puzzle that you don't yet have, make this into an actual sustainable project into the future, this human experiment on Earth?
And we'll just take another one at the same time, please.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm thinking about my imagining from your meditation there. And to me, that future I imagine is without a state and without capital. I'll state my biases. I come from an anarchist, thought process there. In that modality, let me take it back. Capitalism, as we know it, one of its externalities is climate change. And I recognize you come from a community ethic, you want to bring people into the conversation, etc. But you're still a capitalist, and that is, it sounds like, part of your future. And so what I want to ask about is not necessarily the infrastructure, but socially, what does your future look like, and how do we understand the value in that?
Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Okay. So first, to answer this question, we completely need to redesign our systems to be less consumptive, and we can do so. So I'm going to give an example of our company's work because it's real. We're now building the largest passive house project in the United States in East Harlem. It's designed for 7 bands of income going from formerly homeless to 120% of median income, so middle income. And this project will use only 20% of the energy of normal buildings, and it will, and if the power goes out, the temperature basically doesn't go below 62 degrees because it's so well insulated, et cetera. So there are a bunch of things, it's not a perfect answer, but there are a bunch of things we can be doing right now, and that costs 7% more to do. There are a bunch of things we as a society can be doing right now that dramatically reduce our energy and physical and consumption patterns. And you are right, ultimately it's a value system. I read somewhere that the world produces, by the way, the number makes no sense to me, but the world produces 10 billion blue jeans a year. It was like, it's more than the people on the earth. I could not figure out this number, but so that's insane. I'm gonna have to go check this number out again.
We might have to check it out, but I mean, just to add to that, there's something really interesting there in terms of the power of cities, because if you look at it in terms of consumption, right, 60% of carbon emissions are from consumption in cities, like directly caused by cities. If cities take leadership and transform, we completely change the nature of the footprint of cities on the planet, and it is the massive footprint. So, you know, on the one hand, yes, it's a massive problem. On the other hand, that's where the opportunity is.
But anyway, here's the bottom line. The bottom line is that the bottom 50% of the Earth's population from an income point of view is contributing almost nothing to climate change, and the top 50%, and obviously as you go higher up, we're contributing more and more. And so there has to be a redistribution of, in effect, input, outputs or impacts. I totally agree on it. But there's a lot of things we can do. So some are cultural, like why are we making and buying so many blue jeans, and some of it is physical, like the design of passive houses. So to go to your point of view, the problem with capitalism is in its very name. It is the ism of capital. So capitalism's whole purpose is to protect capital, to grow capital, to nurture capital. Capital is an accounting system. I mean, so we need a value system that says our goal is to protect people, to grow people, nurture people, protect nature, grow people, nurture people, integrate them all. And then how can we use this accounting system to help us get there? So look at a paper called Regenerative Capitalism by a guy named John Fullerton. You just Google those words and you'll come up with it, which he reimagines how do you use capitalism, in which it actually says every time you get rewarded in this accounting system for every time the world gets made better, and you get disrewarded every time the world gets made worse. We've let the accounting system rule versus the core values rule. So that's a fundamental shift. But I do believe the system is a useful one for getting, if we knew what our goals were, if we had an ism, a human natureism, it'd be a useful adjunct to it. I do not believe that, the issues before us are so complex that I believe that real individual independence does it. We live in an interdependent system, and therefore true independence is insufficient.
Especially for the scale of the problem.
Yeah.
Yes, and if we can keep them brief, and we'll take 2 at a time. Thank you.
Just 2 seconds. How are you? I live in one of your buildings, and I see your vision. I live on 135th Street. My question to you is, outside of this, is there some way that we can meet? Because there has been a disturbance in your vision.
Yeah.
We have not gotten there. It's disappointing, and we shouldn't have to live like this.
Right.
Because your vision is great. There's been a disconnect in the middle, and in my mind, it's a greater thing to the microcosm of what we're talking about in each system, because there were so many great things
Right.
that up top came in and broke, and there were so many things at the bottom that you were trying to build that we couldn't get together to bring together. So how can I speak to you on a side note so that we can get those together?
So two interesting things. We will.
Because I'm real serious.
So two just very interesting things, which is number one, that I guess let's meet afterwards, and number two, I know what's going on with the building, and actually, I was scheduled to be there this morning. And it was only because you told me, I don't know if you remember, that I had to be here at 9:30 instead of 10. I was actually planning on being
this
there.
would be the only way that I'd get to speak to you because I have several
So
emails
you're here.
unanswered.
So we'll meet right after this. And
Wonderful.
Anyway, something I really care about. You got it.
Thank you.
We'll take one more question,
Yeah.
and then I think we'll have to wrap up. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thanks so much for being here. I just wanted to, I guess, ask a sort of quick question, I think. It seems like we have historical maps for these types of things. So if you
Pull the
think
mic down closer so we can hear you.
so if you think about the New Deal, WPA,
Right.
we've collectively sort of done this before in different ways. So think about that time, there are 125 million people in the city, in the country. Allegedly, that costs about $10 billion adjusted for inflation. If we're talking about this electric grid for the country, and you're saying it's 90 trillion, that cannot.
He said the whole world.
That's the whole world.
Oh, the whole
Yeah,
world,
yeah, yeah.
okay.
And
But, thank you, sorry, it did sound high. But all to say, it seems that cannot just be on the backs of individual taxpayers. So it seems we all have sort of come to an agreement that business has a role to play. How do we move them?
So it's a really important question. It's like the question is really how do we move all of us? Again, I believe that we have a system that is outweighted towards the power of not only of industry but legacy industries. Mm-hmm. So the coal industry has more lobbying power in Washington than the renewable industry, although the renewable industry employs 10 times as many people. So number one, there's a whole how we finance our election reform that really is necessary to kind of rebalance power in the system. What you're seeing is there's some incredibly innovative, responsive, generative businesses around the world. They tend to be the private businesses, and what you're seeing is the laggards tend to be the public businesses. And there's something about the public markets actually that I think make it much harder for businesses to be innovative. But I want to end on a note, which is I attended a panel with a bunch of business guys, some big business leaders who were all talking. And then the head of General Foods said, General Mills said, we see all this coming. And so we're committed to creating 1 million acres of regenerative agriculture over the next 10 years because that is not only the right thing to do for the earth, but that's how we're going to be a prime company. And he also said, we have gotten every bit of chemical and toxicity out of our food. He said, except for one thing, Fruit Loops, because the parents revolted and said they still wanted them that way. So there are companies that actually there are some companies and we need to support them.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you, Jonathan, so much for this conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And I also want to thank our other speakers, Amy Chester, Pablo Mendez-Lazaro, and Tisha Munoz-Erickson for the comments earlier this morning. Thank you, everyone, for coming. It's been a pleasure.